The top 5 worst rulers in European history. Why does a nation love or hate its rulers? In the 21st century, with a media landscape saturated with news and gossip, there are countless reasons. We are witnessing a growing crisis of authority in many countries. Politicians lose trust, their ratings plummet, and a drop in popularity to 20% is a signal of absolute political failure and incompetent leadership. However, history has seen much worse. There were times when public outrage led to confrontations where people didn't just want to remove their rulers, they wanted to tear them apart.
Let's talk about the eras when leaders with absolute power left behind a shameful legacy. We will examine 5 such destinies, starting with a man who was the extra younger brother and became a symbol of greed and utter inadequacy. John Lackland, England, 1199 to 1216. John was born in 1166 to Henry II Plantagenet and Eleanor of Aquitaine. His parents were the most powerful couple in Europe, but by the time John was born, the inheritance had already been divided among his older brothers. His father jokingly nicknamed him Lackland, Jean sans terre, a label that became his curse. John grew up in an atmosphere of betrayal. His brothers fought their father, and his mother spun intrigues from a prison cell where her husband had locked her. British historian Dan Jones, in his book The Plantagenets, 2012, notes that John learned from childhood that loyalty does not exist. There is only profit. When his brother Richard the Lionheart died in 1199, John gained a throne but earned no respect. Instead of wisdom, he chose petty terror. He introduced a tax for refusing military service, scutage, raising it by 300% and collecting it even in peacetime. Historian Mark Morris and Mark Brie indicates in his works that the matter was not a tax, but state-sponsored racketeering. John personally participated in court cases as a prosecutor to find excuses for fines and confiscations, and even took the children of his barons hostage to guarantee their loyalty. It is no surprise that his reign led to the famous Magna Carta in 1215. Barons, exhausted by royal tyranny, revolted and forced John to sign a document that limited royal power. Historians debate its significance. Dan Jones argues it was the first step toward a constitutional state, while others, like Christopher Tyranny, believe it was a temporary concession dictated by the threat of civil war. Our conclusion, however, is indisputable. John Lackland was a symbol of how personal resentment can turn into state tyranny. Notably, the name John was never used again in the English monarchy. Too much negativity is tied to it. Philip II, Spain, 1556 to 1598. Philip was the son of Emperor Charles V and Isabella of Portugal. His parents were the embodiment of contradiction. His father was a courageous warrior knight, while his mother was an ascetic, icy Portuguese beauty with iron discipline. Strict Jesuit tutors raised Philip, while Charles was constantly away on military campaigns. They instilled in him the idea that life is not for joy, but a struggle to fulfill a divine duty where personal desires must submit to biblical laws. Raised in an atmosphere of rigid control and suppressed emotions, Philip ascended the throne in 1556. The Venetian ambassador Michele Suriano wrote in 1559 that the king was secretive, never laughed, and seemed like a man immersed in eternal night. They called him the Spider King. Henry Camin, in his work Spain, 1469 to 1714, A Society of Conflict, notes that Philip created a prison state where intellectual life was smothered for the sake of an illusion of order. Working in Philip's Spain was like being an intern in a corporation where the boss is a serial control freak. He banned music, forced everyone to pray even in the cafeteria, and delayed salaries for any reason. The corporate money went toward building a new headquarters in the form of a monastery, the Escorial. Amazingly, the king sincerely believed that if he worked 16 hours a day correcting errors in courtiers' paperwork, God would miraculously pay off Spain's debts. No miracle occurred. Philip ended his life in 1598, dying for 50 days from gangrene, leaving behind the most powerful army in Europe and a starving populace. History remembers him as the Inquisitor King. Rudolf II, Holy Roman Empire, 1576 to 1612. This golden child of the Habsburgs was the son of Maximilian II and Maria of Spain, who were first cousins. Rudolf inherited the family melancholy and the famous Habsburg jaw. At 11, he was sent to Madrid to be raised by his uncle, Philip II. There, Rudolf witnessed endless funeral processions and the fires of the Inquisition. The result? He returned home convinced that the real world was nothing but suffering. In 1576, he became emperor and immediately moved the court to Prague, mostly because there was less politics and more room for his collection of taxidermy. Contemporary accounts say foreign ambassadors were furious. "We wait for an audience for 6 months," wrote one French diplomat, while His Majesty spends 3 hours staring at a new painting or arguing with an alchemist over the color of the philosopher's stone. Rudolf would hide in the stables for hours just to avoid seeing anyone. He was terrified of sorcery and believed his courtiers were trying to poison him. The stars even forbade him from signing papers on Tuesdays. While Rudolf hid in his tower, the empire fell into an administrative coma. Millions of guilders went to his Kunstkammer, a collection where Titian paintings sat next to a mermaid skeleton, actually a monkey sewn to a fish. Italian researcher Angelo Maria Ripolino, in his cult work Praga Magica, 1973, writes, "Rudolf turned politics into a collection of monstrosities and curiosities." Rudolf never married, though every royal house in Europe sought his hand. When his disgruntled fiancés eventually chose other suitors, Rudolf would explode into a deadly rage. In 1611, the family's patience snapped. His brother Matthias led a rebellion and locked Rudolf in his castle. The failed Grand Master died a year later, surrounded by his beakers, stuffed animals, and debts. Ferdinand VII, Spain, 1808 to 1833. To understand Ferdinand VII, one must look at his cozy childhood. He was the son of the weak-willed Charles IV and the domineering Maria Luisa of Parma. In a family where the mother called her son a mule and a coward, Ferdinand learned to trust no one. In 1808, he staged a coup and forced his father to abdicate. But fate played a trick on him. Napoleon lured him to France and locked him up for 6 years while occupying Spain. While Ferdinand wrote sycophantic letters to Napoleon, congratulating the French on their victories over his people, the Spanish populace fought a brutal guerrilla war for their desired king. They mistakenly believed they were fighting for a martyr. Returning to Madrid in 1814, Ferdinand committed the greatest betrayal in royal history. He tore up the liberal constitution and declared that the dangerous habit of thinking must be eradicated. British historian Charles Esdale, in The Peninsular War, A New History, 2003, calls him the most contemptible monster ever to wear the Spanish crown. Researcher Timothy Chapman notes that Ferdinand uniquely combined absolute cruelty with absolute laziness. While his empire crumbled, he spent his time embroidering gold-threaded dresses for statues of the Virgin Mary. His incompetence cost Spain 80% of its income, as it lost almost all its American colonies. He died in 1833, changing the succession law on his deathbed just to spark a civil war that would ravage Spain for decades. Christian VII, Denmark, 1766 to 1808. This man turned the Danish kingdom into a backdrop for his personal terrifying reality show. His father, Frederick V, handed him over to a sadistic tutor, Count Reventlow, whose pedagogical method was to literally beat the nonsense out of the prince. Little Christian was regularly whipped until he bled and forced to kneel for hours on stone floors. He was so traumatized that by age 15, he had developed severe hallucinatory schizophrenia. When he ascended the throne in 1766 at age 17, Denmark was thrilled. But the broken king sought revenge on the world. He would force his ministers to bark like dogs or jump over tables during state meetings. At night, he roamed Copenhagen with a prostitute, picking fights with watchmen and smashing windows, laughing as his subjects bowed to him in terror. Eventually, his doctor, Johann Friedrich Struensee, took over the government and the queen's bed, while Christian played with toy soldiers. Historian Ulrich Langen, in his work The Powerless, 2008, writes that for Christian, power was a stage for vengeance for his childhood beatings. Christian VII was history's first pranker with an unlimited budget. Imagine a national crisis while your president throws food at ambassadors and demands to be called a dog. He proved that if you are badly beaten as a child, once you have power, you can make the whole world bark on command. Does that remind you of anyone? His end was as absurd as his reign. In 1808, seeing French troops entering the city, he died of a heart attack simply from the sheer fright of seeing enemy soldiers. The Mirror of Power in 2026. Power is a mirror. It made John greedy, Philip a fanatic, Rudolf a madman, Ferdinand a villain, and Christian a broken shell. Today, in February 2026, we look at the approval ratings of leaders like Emmanuel Macron or the controversies surrounding Donald Trump. We see politicians accused of narcissism or being out of touch. But history reminds us, we are lucky. Modern democracy is a heavy-duty fuse. Today's system doesn't allow a ruler to spend decades barking at voters or wasting the budget on magic crystals. They are replaced quickly through elections, court rulings, or no-confidence votes. Modern villains simply don't have the chance at the absolute power our heroes possessed. So, who do you think is the ultimate anti-hero of these five? And which modern leader has already booked their place on this list 100 years from now? Please share the name in the comments so we can compare whose anti-rating is higher today. Like this video if your boss at least doesn't make you bark during meetings, and subscribe. We will continue to dig through the dirty laundry of history that archaeologists find and textbooks try to hide.